I'm here with Dr. Hindol Sengupta, who I must confess has written an extremely engaging and extremely interesting book entitled Sing, Dance and Pray, the divine play in the life of Srila Prabhupada. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Srila Prabhupada. I'm sure some of you are. But I'm sure all of you are familiar with ISKCON, right? The International Society of Krishna Consciousness, which is a very ubiquitous presence in many cities in India and in many cities throughout the world as well. Srila Prabhupada founded ISKCON as a movement. And it was a very interesting thing for someone like Srila Prabhupada to do, right? Given his background and all of that, all of which I hope to talk to Hindol about a little bit over the next few minutes, right? In some ways, Srila Prabhupada was instrumental in establishing the area or the terrain of global Hinduism in the same way that Swami Vivekananda had done in the 19th century, right? Would you agree, Hindol, that he was a very interesting, very important figure, and perhaps he's not been talked about as much as, say, Swami Vivekananda has?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you look at the genre of global Hinduism, Srila Prabhupada has the largest footprint, as it were, after Vivekananda. Vivekananda, of course, is a seminal figure, but after him comes Srila Prabhupada, who has actually, in fact, geographically a much bigger spread. And in that sense, Swami Vivekananda, and I've said this many times before in various other platforms, that Swami Vivekananda had more or less a sort of academic, intellectual following, right? Many of his followers were, part of the elite and the gentry of those countries. Many of them were academics, including the man who wrote the letter for Swami Vivekananda to go to Harvard, to go to the Chicago, Parliament of Religions, was in fact a professor of Harvard, right? Whereas Srila Prabhupada's journey was, in a sense, very different. His was a more, what today we would call a more grassroots journey. He basically landed at the age of 70 at using a cargo ship called the Jaladuta, traveling through the choppy waters, and landed in America at the age of 70. And he only lived for about 10 years after that. So in that 10 or 11 years that he lived after that, Srila Prabhupada managed to create a global network of temples which he himself built, he and his followers, right? And nothing of the kind had ever existed before he managed to do something like this. So it's an incredible feat. I mean, you think about a 70-year-old man, in an unfamiliar terrain, an unfamiliar country, building this entire, network of religious institutions, right? In societies which have very little to do with India, very little to do with Hinduism, and very little to do with, an understanding of Hindu culture. Today, of course, things are much better known. But imagine, when Srila Prabhupada was doing this work, I mean, so little was known in those societies about India or about Indian culture, Hindu culture, and so on and so forth. So it is an incredible feat in many ways. It's an incredible feat if you look at it from the fact that this is a septuagenarian who's doing it. It's an incredible feat also because he's doing it using not Indians, not Hindus, but they're all Caucasian, mostly white, some were of course non-white also, but mostly white, young Caucasians in their 20s and 30s, right? Many of whom had been hippies, right? And many of whom had accessed, psychotropic substances in many shapes and forms. So to use a bunch of such people, convince them of the superiority of the spiritual message that he had, convincing them to be part of a movement, that then proceeded to grow across the world in 100 places, is a remarkable feat. It's a remarkable feat not only in terms of spirituality, but also of organization building, right? And that fascinates me because, at the age of 70, most people are thinking about retirement, whereas Srila Prabhupada proceeded, and all because his guru had told him that you understand English well, and you should create this entire network, right? So he proceeded to build this incredible movement around the world, and also, and I'm sure we will touch upon the subject, gained some really illustrious followers, in America, in England, in other parts of the world. So after Vivekananda, to answer your question, Karthik, Srila Prabhupada has the most definitive impact as far as global Hinduism is concerned. And indeed, Srila Prabhupada's geographical spread in terms of geographical footprint is much larger than Swami Vivekananda.
No, it's interesting you mentioned that, he actually began doing this at the age of 70, right, in 1965. I mean, the 60s were a time of great ferment in America, especially. The civil rights movement was going on and so on and so forth. And Prabhupada happened to be there, and he gained all these followers from among, like you say, hippies and other kinds of young people. But what do you think this 70-year-old man from India wearing saffron robes, right? What is it that he could have said or done that appealed to these young Caucasian, mostly Caucasian people? What did he have that attracted so many people to him?
Well, I think he also, like many people, not only had a unique message, but the message was also falling on very sort of fertile ground. You see, many of the people who first listened to Srila Prabhupada's message in New York were people who were young participants of the anti-war movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement in America. There were people disillusioned by the American military-industrial complex, to use a more contemporary phraseology. They were people who were disillusioned by American capitalism. And they wanted to return to a different kind of world, a different kind of life, a life more grounded, a life more rooted, a life more centered, a life more spiritual, right? But they did not find in their ecosystem people or figures who could give that message convincingly. Not only give that message convincingly, but also clearly seem to be living that message. Now, it helped that Srila Prabhupada was also already 70, because you see, it gives a sense that this was not a man who was at the beginning of his journey. It was a man who had, in a sense, completed his journey. So there was that authenticity, again, to use a more contemporary phraseology. So he would have had this bearing of authenticity, right? This Bengali man from India, 70 years old, shaved head, who always wore a dhoti and a kurta. He would have seemed like the real deal, so to speak, to the hippies of New York, right? That, okay, here's this guy who knows what he's talking about, who comes from a more rooted tradition, who feels that godliness inside him and lives that spirituality at a day-to-day basis. And therefore, he was able to convince all these people looking for answers that he had a different message, and indeed the answer was in that message, right? Yesterday, at another session, I was saying, during my research for this book, I discovered, it's become very interesting for researchers. We find information about the books we write in all kinds of places. When I started writing books about 15 years ago, we would go to archives and we would go to libraries. Today, we find information in all kinds of places, including in YouTube. So I found a video on YouTube, which is a recording of a famous series of debates in America at the peak of the anti-Vietnam War protest between the right and the left, two terms very familiar to everybody in India these days. So and there were these two young intellectuals, Allen Ginsberg from the quote-unquote left and William Buckley Jr. from quote-unquote the right. And they would have these televised debates on the Vietnam War, right? One person would try to convince the other person. And in one of those debates, incredibly, Allen Ginsberg, who had come in touch with Srila Prabhupada and was, moved by Srila Prabhupada and helped Srila Prabhupada, and had started sort of reciting the Maha Mantra, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. You don't expect to find that in such a debate. And yet, in this incredible moment, in that video, there's a moment when William Buckley Jr. is asking Allen Ginsberg, why do you think this about the Vietnam War? But actually, America can do this and do that. And this man says, well, you're not really understanding what I'm trying to tell you. Maybe you'll understand if I say it in a different way. And he pulls out this little harmonium, this mini micro harmonium, and he begins to play it on stage and sing the Maha Mantra. And the camera pans to William Buckley Jr.'s face, And the man has never heard something like this before. He's a young American conservative, the leading lights of the conservative movement in America. And he's stupefied. He has this, you must go and see this video, it's incredible. He doesn't know what hit him. And he's like, what is this? And he literally says at the end of it, what is this? And Allen Ginsberg, who's this great revolutionary poet, so many of you would know of his poem called Howl and so on and so forth, right? Very, very anti-establishment. He says, well, this is the message of peace. This is the message of love. This is the message of non-hate, so to speak. This is the message of anti-war, right? So it's an incredible feat. And, as I researched, I realized that Allen Ginsberg helped Srila Prabhupada and other disciples of Srila Prabhupada with all kinds of legal issues, with the tax department, with immigration authorities, all kinds of things, right? Because he was an influential character. Cut to Britain, the other great, and my book begins with this character, George Harrison of the Beatles fame. George Harrison later turns out to be one of the most devout and one of the most influential Krishna consciousness devotees around the world. In fact, his daughter, Dhani Harrison, continues to be a very devout Krishna bhakt, so to speak. So George Harrison is another incredible figure who comes in touch with Srila Prabhupada and then proceeds to, in a sense, convince Srila Prabhupada that the thing to do would be to create a record, a new record which essentially would spread the Mahamantra around the world, right? And, Srila Prabhupada proceeds to cut this record and it becomes an album and it becomes a super hit. So, you can see how all these sort of cultural influences of that time is sort of marrying into the story of Srila Prabhupada.
We've spoken a lot about Srila Prabhupada in America,
Yeah.
right? The influential people he met and who were influenced by him so much so that they became his followers. Throw some light on his early life in India.
Yeah.
Because unlike Vivekanand, Srila Prabhupada did not take sannyas at a young age.
No.
He was married, he ran a successful business and so on. And still, through all of that, he remained some kind of a devout figure.
Yeah.
And then eventually he chose this life. Throw some light on his early life for us, just to kind of put him in context in that sense.
Well, it is not often remembered that one of Srila Prabhupada's school mates or school contemporaries was Subhash Chandra Bose. So in a sense, he was the child of the Indian freedom movement. He grew up at an era where near his home and on the streets, people were burning masses of clothes and items that they had bought from the British, so to speak, and moving to Khadi, right? So he grew up in that revolutionary moment, right? And he was very much, remember, Srila Prabhupada is somebody who refused to accept his final degree because he rejected the colonial edifice, so to speak, right? So another incredible thing about him that's not well known. It's just that quite like Vivekananda, and here again there's a parallel, because remember, Vivekananda's early days was also in the gymnasiums of the Anushanal Samiti, right? A network of, akharas and gymnasiums where the revolutionaries would pass information through chits. And there's an incredible history there. But quite like Vivekananda, Srila Prabhupada chose to take his revolutionary ferment towards the direction of an inner life. He had grown up in this universe of Krishna Bhakti, and he chose to take it to a spiritual level. And here, there is this incredible conversation, again, quite like Vivekananda, Srila Prabhupada has with his guru, and Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. And, where he says, well, there's this revolutionary moment, and we should all be part of this moment, and we need to change India and get it freedom. And his guru says, well, the best way you can do that is to practice your spirituality and set human beings truly free, which is also only possible through the love of God, right? So he sort of takes it in a different journey, quite like Vivekananda, who himself was part of a different part of the revolutionary movement, but then decided that the best way to do it was to promote Indian spirituality, to give people real peace as he saw it, right? Srila Prabhupada also, went through that journey, had a very similar conversation with his guru, and came to the conclusion through his life that the best way to, protect India's freedom and indigenous sense of self, really, was to promote spirituality, to promote a devotion to God as he saw it, to promote the Mahamantra, and that he needed to do, again, in a sense, the empire talking back, not just in India, but he needed to do around the world. Because remember, Srila Prabhupada didn't really see much success in India. He tried to build a movement in India, but not very successfully, right? It is only when he lands up in America that he begins to see real success of a particular scale, right? Exactly like Vivekananda. Vivekananda wasn't very successful as long as he was in India. You know, he was still discovering himself. When he returns from America, he has this incredible impact, right? So exactly, Srila Prabhupada, when he goes to America, he's able to create this tremendous movement, and he's all over the press. You know, people are talking about him. The New York Times writes about him. And that creates a ripple which sort of travels back to the Gaudiya Vaishnavite community, in a sense, in India, which realizes that in many ways they have discovered a sort of unlikely leader in a 70-year-old man sitting not in Vrindavan, but in America, right? So that's another really incredible thing.
I mean, we've all heard a lot about Vivekananda's guru, right? Ramakrishna Paramahamsa,
Yeah.
who put him on a certain path.
Yeah.
And clearly, I think Srila Prabhupada's guru also had a huge influence on him. And we don't know too much about who his guru was, etc. I must confess, I had no idea about him till I read your book. So tell us a little bit about him,
So I think that's a subject for a different book, which I'm thinking about, and so on and so forth. But let me tell you a little bit. See, you have to understand this in context. In the Renaissance period of Bengal, the society of Bengal went through a huge, change. That change brought about a bunch of, for the lack of a better word, transformative spiritual movements. We know about two of these movements. One, of course, was Brahmo Samaj. Everybody knows about them, or many people know about them. The second was this entire Ramakrishna Vivekananda lineage, right? A sort of neo-Vedantist, movement. The third is lesser known. The third was, in a sense, a sort of reformist Gaudiya Math. And I mentioned this in my book in an entire chapter, where I talk about how Srila Prabhupada's guru and his guru, right, were seminal figures in reforming Vaishnavism during that period of the Renaissance and creating a whole new chapter, a new version of Vaishnavism, which they said, quite like the Neo-Vedantists, actually tapped into the very roots of Vaishnavism. They said, we are only doing what Sri Chaitanya did. It is after Sri Chaitanya that things got, far more muddied, and the original spirit of Vaishnavism got lost. This is exactly the argument Vivekananda would make, saying the Vedantic truths had got muddied and had got sullied, and we needed to go back to the original Vedanta to understand what its power is. Exactly the same way, in the Vaishnavite tradition, these men were saying, we are the original inheritors of the message of Chaitanya, the egalitarian message of Chaitanya, the pluralistic message of Chaitanya, the message of Chaitanya whose love did not keep aside anybody. Whereas the Vaishnavism they saw around them, in many cases, had become sullied by the world, so to speak, and its politics and so on and so forth. So they were leading a whole reformist trend. Only the biggest figure that would come out of that entire journey was Srila Prabhupada, right? These men began it because even Srila Prabhupada's guru had already started trying to reach out to other countries, people around the world, and so on and so forth. But it would come to its natural conclusion as a global movement with the ISKCON of Srila Prabhupada, right? So in a sense, great spiritual reform movement comes out of the Renaissance period of Bengal. Brahmo Samaj, the Vedantism of Sri Ramakrishna and Vivekananda, and much lesser known, and I hope it will be much better known in the years to come, the reformist ideas of the gurus of Srila Prabhupada and Srila Prabhupada himself. So the reformism, the plurality that they demonstrated, his gurus demonstrated in India by saying that, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu said that anybody who sings the name of the Lord is included in the love, right? He takes that message and gives it a global dimension. He says not just in India. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu said that the name of the Lord would be sung on every street, right? Therefore, why only? He didn't say every street in India. He said every street everywhere, right? So he finished the everywhere part of it, taking it around the world, right?
Okay, one last question before I throw it open to the audience, right? Where is the ISKCON movement today? Srila Prabhupada, of course, is long gone, right? How big is it? How many followers does it have? Some kind of an idea can we get from you?
So, look, that's an entirely different subject, and I don't want to go too much into that for the simple reason that my book ends at the death of Srila Prabhupada, right? So my intensive research was on the life of Srila Prabhupada. I would not, pretend to be an expert on the history of ISKCON after Srila Prabhupada. That's an entirely different project, and hopefully one day that project too will be done. But of course, we can at least say this much, that ISKCON continues to have a global footprint, right? I mean, it's certainly a movement that continues to grow, continues to have a global footprint, but I don't want to go too much into that detail because I don't consider myself at this point in time an expert on that. If I ever delve into that matter and to that material, I'm sure we will come back and have a conversation about that. But certainly, till the death of Srila Prabhupada, there is a whole sort of history. What happens after Srila Prabhupada is gone is an entirely separate history waiting to be told.